Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Department of Anthropology colloquium series. Today's speaker is Dr. David Groenfeldt. Dr. Groenfeldt is an adjunct professor of anthropology here at the University of New Mexico and founding director of the Water Culture Institute in Santa Fe. From his PhD research at the University of Arizona on the socio-economic impacts of large-scale canal irrigation in India to his current work on water ethics, Dr. Groenfeldt research and consulting have been focused on water. His employment history includes 5 years with the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka, 7 years with the World Bank's Water Cluster, 4 years with the Santa Fe Watershed Association, and since 2010, the Water Culture Institute in Santa Fe. He is the author of the book Water Ethics, A Values Approach to Solving the Water Crisis, the second edition of which was published in 2019, and co-author of the book Global Water Ethics Toward a Global Ethics Charter, published in 2017. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that UNM is located on the traditional land of the Pueblo of Sandia. The land holds deep historical, spiritual, and personal significance for New Mexico's indigenous peoples. We acknowledge their connection to the land, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live and work and learn here. The title of Dr. Groenfeldt's talk is Crafting a New Water Ethic from the Values of Our Better Angels. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'll jump into this if I can. There we go. So you already said the title, which I wanted to emphasize that we have water values that we don't really make use of as well as we might. And the first kind of question that I think we face in thinking about water is, what is good use of water? Is it a fountain at a hotel in Las Vegas, or is it processing copper ore in Arizona, or irrigating alfalfa for cattle in Clovis, New Mexico? And our water use is embedded, as anthropologists know, in culture. And there are two contrasting cultures of water that are both very relevant today, is the modern secular approach, represented in this slide of the Ataturk Dam in Southeast Anatolia, one of the largest in the world, if not the largest, smaller than the ones in China though. And the contrasting cultural approach of traditional spiritual water as a relative, regarding water as somebody like a person relative, a grandmother, for example. And water values change over time, which is a good thing because we need some changes in our water values. But in the 1960s, it was common. It wasn't only common, but it was perfectly accepted for industries to pollute rivers, and rivers were seen as the rightful place to discard waste. Dams were seen as adding value to rivers. They could still be controversial for flooding big areas, but it wasn't a rights of nature kind of discussion for the most part. Urban waterscapes were not at all desirable, quite the opposite. Indigenous communities had no right, or were seen as having no moral right, to block river infrastructure, even if it destroyed their communities. Water policies should be set by experts, not by ignorant people. And contrast that with 60 years later, which is close enough to where we are now. Water pollution in general is illegal, or at least it's immoral. Some dams are being removed and new dams are facing intense scrutiny. Urban waterscapes are great places to invest in real estate right now, as long as it's not the ocean with subject to climate rising. Indigenous communities should have control over their traditional waters, according to, I don't have polling information on this, but in spite of the failure on the surface of Standing Rock that the pipeline went through, I think if you polled Americans at the time, they would say that they would be on the side of the Standing Rock and their Native American allies. And all stakeholders should have an input on water policy. Participation is seen as vital. Now, ethics and values, if you listen carefully, you'll find that I often mix them a little bit without distinguishing. But in general, ethics are the manifestation of our values. We have values, and ethics is based on those values and suggests to us what behaviors we should adopt to honor the values that we claim to hold. But there's always a little difference between what our values actually are and what we do. And that's why we feel guilty, which is maybe not a bad thing in this case. And there's also a time lag. It takes a long time for values to be expressed in ethics, and it takes a long time for values to change, in my experience. I mean, hopefully we can speed up the process. But an example is decommissioning dams in the Pacific Northwest, motivated by reprioritizing the values of salmon to native cultures and to the regional tourist economy and regional identity. It's not only economics, but that's part of it. Along the Klamath River, for example, 4 dams are slated to come down by 2024 after about 2 decades of negotiations opening 400 miles of river habitat. That comes from the Sierra Club's website. But that's just an example that our values really do change. But we're not always aware of what our values are. Is the dry Rio Grande a product of our values, or is it dry because we just haven't paid attention to what our values actually are? Our use of our rivers and groundwater does not reflect what I'm calling the values of our better angels. This is an angel from Paris, from one of the bridges across the Seine, in a nice light. The Rio Grande and the Colorado River no longer reach the sea. The vast majority of New Mexico's scarce water supports water-intensive crops and mega dairies at the expense of riparian biodiversity. I'm not going to go into a litany of all the things that are wrong, but I just want to suggest that the values that we have are probably better than the values that we express. So it's not that we have the wrong values. We need to hold ourselves accountable to act according to the values that we already hold. And ethics is the application of values. And this is the purpose for engaging in ethical reflection, to give ourselves a little space to connect with our internal values. And this is my quote: "An ounce of reflection can be worth a pound of mitigation." To operationalize our values, we need 2 things: an awareness of what our values are, and ethical reflection to kind of get in touch with those values. Now, what could or should be the role of ethics in water resources management? It's interesting that ethics is rarely, and to my mind, never, invoked as a significant reason for adopting a particular water policy. I think one exception for that, there's always an exception, is the human right to water, which passed in the UN General Assembly in 2010. And I think that there was an applied ethics working among the delegates who voted for including the right to water as part of the human rights concept. But normally, when we ask for water experts to weigh in on a proposed project, we're talking about lawyers, economists, engineers, hydrologists, social scientists, journalists, and even psychologists, but not ethicists. And I mean, nobody thinks of calling in an ethicist. Now, it sounds weird maybe because we don't do it, but in other disciplines, ethicist can be a job category. Medical ethicists advise hospitals. Technology ethicists are in demand to assess the constructive uses and dangers of using artificial intelligence. Business and investment ethicists help companies develop ESG, environment, social, and governance strategies. The journal AI and Ethics seeks to promote informed debate and discussion of the ethical, regulatory, and policy implications that arise from the development of AI. Now, both the AI and health fields deal with threats to the sustainability of human life. so they're taken seriously. But water is even more critical to survival of humans and non-human life. And where are those water ethicists when we need them? Recruiting an ethicist presumes that there is already a relevant field for ethics, a field of ethics within the relevant discipline for the advisor to be guided by. You're not going to hire an ethicist without knowing what he's going to do. In businesses, there's a long-established field of business ethics with dozens, I was surprised, I looked this up, dozens of academic journals and courses in most business ethics, on business ethics in most business schools. The premier journal in business, though, is the Journal of Business Ethics, which has been around since 1982. Now, how do we find guidance for crafting a new water ethic when we don't have a robust field of water ethics and we don't have any ethicist job descriptions for water that at least that I'm aware of? The only ethics job description that I'm aware of is 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗄𝗃 is a professor at Technical University in Delft in the Netherlands, who is a professor of water ethics and engineering. But that's, so I'll get to her book in a minute. Now, the guidance that we do have in the water world, where the water world is rich, is in having lots of international conferences, bringing together a great mix of people, and on defined topics like groundwater management, water quality, ecological biodiversity, and in aquatic systems and things like that. And many of those conferences conclude with a statement, a declaration statement about why the water discipline should incorporate their values into the best practices and into the larger world of water management. The framework that has been used most commonly is IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management, recently joined by the One Water concept, which is kind of an add-on to IWRM. But it recognizes the importance of any kind of water use. It doesn't really play favorites. It doesn't say indigenous uses of water are less important than Nestle's bottling of water or anything. It just tries to take all the uses of water and look at how they interact and try to avoid conflicts between them, but it doesn't really judge them. They don't have an ethics component, but they do have a sense of let's try to make this work for everybody. Another famous normative framework currently is the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, 17 goals and I don't know, 150 targets or something like that, including one of the development goals, number 6, is exclusively about water, and water comes into a number of the other ones too. So I'm going to talk about this in a second. The other thing that we have on our favor in terms of having kind of a sense of water ethics within the field of water is a growing literature on water ethics, including some of my books. And a third thing that we have going for us is a water ethics charter, which was drafted in 2015 and has not been applied in any significant way, but offers guidance about what does ethical water use mean. And I'll talk about that as well. So first, the normative frameworks for water that, in my view, provide a basis for a new water ethics. So I already mentioned IWRM, and the nexus approach is the connections between water used for food, for agriculture, or for energy, that looking at, so the nexus approaches just take water and another sector and look at how they either compete or have synergies between them. The Sustainable Development Goals of the UN is really important because together those goals define what the UN calls the world we want. Now, maybe not everybody wants that world, but it's a pretty good world. It's progressive values in general. I'm just going to read through these because they're all important and as bases contributing to the development of normative water management, which is what water ethics is all about. So the concept of environmental flow, keeping rivers alive, and maintaining biodiversity is seen in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. That's the UNCBD. And they have their own targets for how much area, land area, or they don't have riverscapes, but land, ocean, protected areas, and also wetlands. So that there are metrics for trying to get a handle on how much biodiversity is remaining and what's under threat. And what we need to know is that aquatic ecosystems are under intense threat and they're losing biodiversity every year. Water integrity there's a water integrity network, an offshoot from Transparency International, that does education and training to prevent massive corruption in the water sector, where it's ripe for corruption because water infrastructure is just so expensive, and it's hard to kind of keep a lid on the corruption, and makes a huge difference in outcomes on health and environment. The human right to water of the UN is a statement that about everyone has access, should have access. It's your human right to be able to access safe water and sanitation. The water stewardship is a business-oriented concept of looking at how businesses can become stewards of the water that they use, and also reach out to other water users within their plant, near their factory, for example, so that it's not just, I'll give a local example, Intel's chip manufacturing plant in Rio Rancho, that they're using a lot of water for their chips, and then water stewardship implies that, well, you also need to reach out to other water users and become part of the water using community, which they do. But there's an organization that the water stewardship standard, it has been developed to create a label for businesses, with training for consultants to certify the businesses that comply with the water stewardship standard. The IWA, International Water Association, has 17 principles for water-wise cities. So they define, set standards for what should cities be doing to conserve their water and promote sustainability. The rights of nature movement, made famous by the water protectors at Standing Rock in the US in 2016, 2017, trying to stop a water pipeline, oil pipeline, which they weren't able to stop, but they might be successful in a few years of getting it stopped belatedly. The Commons movement there's a Great Lakes Commons, and there's a lot of interest academically in the concept from the International Association for the Study of the Commons. Water justice has gotten the attention of the World Council of Churches, that's the WCC, through their EWN, Ecumenical Water Network. Water governance principles were promulgated by the OECD a few years ago, I think in 2015, and they've refined them a little bit since then. But basically setting a standard for what governments should do, how governments should make sure that their legal framework around water is consistent with sustainability goals. And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is an example of promoting and justifying cultural diversity and indigenous ontologies that and giving legitimacy to different ways of cultural living, which is what anthropology as a discipline is all about. These are the SDG targets within the goal, number 6 goal, of which is the water target. I'm not going to go through these, but just that there are lots of little targets, which is a good thing because we can monitor how we're doing in reaching these targets, which we're supposed to reach by 2030. Secondly is the literature on water ethics, which is not bad. I mean, it could be better, there could be more of it, but at least there's something. It starts out in 1993 with Sandra Pestel talking about devoting one chapter of her book, Last Oasis, to the concept of water ethics and saying something like why we need a water ethic or the missing piece, a water ethic. UNESCO had a project on water and ethics from 97 to 2004, producing 11 pamphlets. I'll use my pointer over here. And that same initiative, even after it was concluded in 2004, was picked up by the Botín Foundation in Spain and resulted in a book called Water Ethics, which is a collection of essays. And I think one of the more important publications is also called Water Ethics, Foundational Readings for Students and Professionals by Peter Brown and Jeremy Schmidt, came out in 2010 and just republished articles on water ethics, not necessarily using the term water ethics, but talking about water and talking about ethics. And it's kind of set a baseline, like this is where we are, and opening up the floodgates for more specifically targeted ethical treatments of water policy. Special edition of Water Policy Journal on water ethics in 2012. 2013 is This Is My Book, Water Ethics, A Values Approach to Solving the Water Crisis. And Just Water came out the next year, 2014, which is about the Catholic Church and the Vatican and the way they use their religious principles as guidance for how water should be managed. And Global Water Ethics is another book, edited volume by Raphael Ziegler and myself, which took conference papers from the environmental ethics meetings in 2015 and turned it into a book on water ethics, which also specifically talked about the Water Ethics Charter, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes. And some more recent books, Loving Water Across Religions, a second edition of Just Water, a second edition of my 2013 book, published in 2019, because I wanted to update it with the Water Ethics Charter project, which I'll talk about. And lower right here, Water Ethics and Introduction is by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, the professor from TU Delft who holds a chair that has water ethics in the title. It's Water Ethics in Engineering or something like that. But so there's a vibrant, both our books claim to be comprehensive looks at water ethics, which they are, but there's very little overlap between them. So that's a good sign that there's room for more books on water ethics. Now, another resource that we have to draw on in the water field in terms of water ethics is a Global Water Ethics Charter, which nobody knows about because it was a project that got partway through and the funding ran out. But there is a draft water ethics charter dated June 30th, 2015. This is a screenshot that I took this morning just to show you that it does exist. And I want to run through the provisions of the water ethics charter briefly, but suggest that you look at this URL. All you have to remember is waterethics.org, and you can find there's a tab for water ethics charter. And it was the idea of developing a water ethics charter was proposed by the World Water Forum in Marseille in 2012. I don't know if you are familiar with the World Water Forums. Every 3 years until 2021, which is in the middle of COVID, in March, there has been a World Water Conference that moves around the globe. And it's not really a policy setting conference, but it has an influence, and they always come out with recommendations. And the recommendations trickle up from the sessions they have about what the sessions were on. And we had, there were several sessions on water ethics. Well, not several, 2 sessions on water ethics. And from those sessions came the suggestion that was amplified by the forum concluding session that yes, what we need is a charter, a statement of principles on water ethics. So I got involved in this because Water Culture Institute is by far the smallest of the group that was interested in following up, and we had the most to gain, I think, in terms of name recognition. So we kind of coordinated a little bit and roped in the support of UNESCO, because they already had a history of water ethics work, the French Water Academy, where there was the president was personally interested in it, the Botín Foundation from Spain, and Water Culture Institute from Santa Fe, that's my institute. And we developed a statement of what the water ethics ought to be, what we thought they should be. But we wrote it as a group with, the idea behind that we have to vet this with people around the world. UNESCO helped us do that, and we got comments from a first draft. We got comments from 30 comments out of 80 letters sent asking for the reaction. So it was vetted fairly well, because it was vetted by people who were really interested in the idea and experts in their own fields of water and from all over the world. And it wasn't just the friends of friends or that kind of thing. It was done through the bureaucratic process of UNESCO. And then on that basis, we redrafted, I call it a 0 draft here, but what the title on the website is Draft 2.0, which is, it's available for, you can use it, you can ignore it, you can do anything you want with it, but it seeks to establish the moral and ethical foundations to guide decision-making. Now, I've highlighted parts of the slides here because I'm aware of time, and I'm going to flag, I'm only going to read the highlighted portions, and for the full-bodied document, I encourage you to look at waterethics.org and just read it. It's about 6 pages of single space, so it's not terribly onerous to look at, and it has some internal contradictions, but it's a pretty good document, and it's great for doing what we wanted it to do, which is what ethicists ought to do, which is reflect on the ethics of what we're saying. Water ecosystems have inherent rights and values. The precautionary principle is important. I mean, it is critical, and we usually ignore it. And another operational principle is no net loss from current conditions. Like, the environment is suffering enough, let's not impose further wounds. So those are the environmental issues. And then the economic issues: water has an inherent economic dimension. Water use should be reasonable and frugal. I really like that term frugal, which sounds moralistic because it is. Private ownership of water must also be accountable to the larger society. That means that just because you own the water legally doesn't mean that other people don't have an interest in it, and they do, because somewhere else we say that water is a commons, and it physically is a commons because nobody can kind of take it all. They can't control it. So it should be a commons, and it is a commons, but we've legally contradicted that by offering private ownership of water. Water for basic human needs should be effectively free. That means low cost. It doesn't mean it doesn't cost anything, but it shouldn't be onerous to pay for it. And the concept of polluter pays, which itself is controversial, because that you don't want industries, which they do now, is they pollute and then they pay a small fee, but that's not an incentive not to pollute. So that's problematic, but lots of these things are. The beauty of water ethics, I feel, as a way of channeling behavior, is that it's not legally binding. There are no teeth, because they're moral teeth, but they're not legal teeth. And that makes everything a little softer. And it makes it, I think, easier to find common ground across different interest groups. Everybody wants the same water for different reasons, for different purposes. And if you had they would never agree on strict legal interpretations of that they should share the water with other people. But when it's just an ethical principle, a guideline, it's a little bit easier to accept. Social principles that were included in the Water Ethics Charter is that this is mirroring this is a UN sanctioned human right, but we still have to put it in our charter to show that it's there. Access to safe water and sanitation is a human right, but it also carries individual responsibilities for engaging in water decision making. Water is a common good for society and nature. And I feel that's particularly important in New Mexico, where the common good concept is recognized by the 𝗖𝐞𝐩𝐭, but it's not recognized by New Mexico water law, which sees, that you have a right to use your allocation for agricultural water for whatever crops you want to grow, as long as there's some water there. So, and another common good issue that comes up in Santa Fe is the use of private wells as for gardens and lawns and golf courses and things. That a private well is tapping into a common aquifer that Santa Fe depends on for its future. So water is a common good. Whether it's being treated that way or not is another matter. And ensure water justice for all segments of society, including future generations. Now, cultural and spiritual principles in the charter are water, and I think this is pretty important. Water and water ecosystems provide cultural and spiritual meaning of fundamental importance. That means that the culture itself depends on the sustainability of the Rio Grande, for example, for the Rio Grande Pueblos. Rights of indigenous and traditional peoples to live according to their cultural traditions is recognized in our charter, and that's borrowing language from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So everything we put in the charter has a heritage from somebody's declaration or some group's declaration, no individuals here. Water infrastructure development, like dams, levees, and canals, should accommodate customary cultural uses as a matter of priority, and free, prior, and informed consent of local indigenous stakeholders is a cultural right. So if they don't agree, you can't just build the pipeline anyway. So that's what Standing Rock was about, really, is that the tribe did not give their free, prior, and informed consent. The government's position, the US government's position was it wasn't on their reservation land, it was only their traditional ancestral land. But in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they don't make a distinction between what a national government considers tribal and what the tribal people consider tribal. So anyway, on water governance is the last component. Adopt a broad ecological frame to incorporate whole watersheds, aquifers, and coastal marine systems. That means, take a landscape approach is what the governance principle is saying, and reflect interests of all stakeholders, including the powerless groups. But that's kind of almost an oxymoron, that how are powerless groups going to have their interests reflected? And that's why they need a charter. And the principle of subsidiarity is that water management should be done at the lowest practical level, like local control over local water decisions is what we should be aiming for, with some oversight from government. You need that kind of regulation, but day-to-day management should be local if possible. And water conflict resolution mechanisms need to be designed into governance arrangements, otherwise it's not going to be sustainable. Now, how to operationalize water ethics? It's a fairly easy recipe, I think. Identify and map water values, reach a working consensus about those values, document the values and principles into something you write down. I call it a charter, you could call it a statement. Apply the principles to water decisions, monitor compliance, and resolve the inevitable value conflicts. Go back to step 2 and work your way up again. Now, it's my contention that a new water ethic can emerge through the process of clarifying our water values. For example, restoring river health. These are just kind of a list of kind of key values. Restoring river health, recognizing water as a commons, equitable access to water, social justice, free, prior, and informed consent, reflect interests of all stakeholders. So that's the recipe. When do we need to start? And the answer, of course, is now or yesterday, because we have less than 10 years to adopt a new relationship with the earth. And it takes time to establish a new and healthier relationship. Values and ethics can guide our response to the water crisis. In fact, they should be guiding our response. They lead us to reflect on our water values. This is the intersection at Cerrillos and St. Francis in Santa Fe, by the way. It was a protest against the South Dakota DAPL project. Oops. So we reflect on our water values on all dimensions: environment, economic, social, cultural, governance, and ask the question, what are our better angels telling us? And they're telling us to raise awareness, acknowledge the crisis, develop new messages and strategies, and act with urgency. And in that process, we need to keep all 5 dimensions of water values in mind. And I'm just regurgitating those 5 categories of water values that is also written into the water charter: environmental values, economic values, social values, cultural values, and governance values. And they all interact and they're all important. But the most important, I think, because of where we are in climate change, is environmental. And that, I feel, needs to be prioritized because of the climate emergency. That environment becomes a central priority and needs to. Aquatic systems are collapsing and need protection. Intergenerational equity depends on ecosystem protection. Social and economic priorities, also important, culture, and as well as culture and governance. In other words, by giving priority to the environment, we're not taking away from other subsectors like social and economic and cultural governance. We're allowing them we're allowing the physical systems to survive long enough to serve, to be recognized, to serve their social, economic, cultural, and governance purpose. We don't have time to adapt. We need to adopt a new ecocentric paradigm for water. We need to recognize rights of rivers, rights of future generations to healthy water ecosystems, the rights of indigenous peoples to protect the rivers they depend on, and the concepts of environmental justice and participatory governance. And we need to reconcile with nature. This is Lake Michigan, by the way, in Wisconsin. The steps to reconcile with nature are to recognize water as an ethical domain. That's a big one. That's kind of the most important part of my talk, if you don't remember anything else, that water is and needs to be an ethical domain, like the way medicine is. That we have a responsibility to protect aquatic systems and bequeath healthy systems to future generations. We also need to acknowledge past and current water injustice to nature and to indigenous peoples and to others through dams, mines, rivers, river, lake, and wetland grabbing, like land grabbing, and biodiversity loss. We need to adopt an eco-centric water ethic where we can all become water protectors, and our better angels will be proud of us. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. Does anybody have any questions? If you have questions, just go ahead and turn on your camera and feel free to ask a question. I have one question. In our department, one thing that we talk about occasionally is career paths that are not in academia, that can come from a background in anthropology. And there is a lot in your talk, the content of your talk, that I could ask some other questions about, but I'm actually, I don't want to miss this opportunity to ask you a broader question about how you went from being an anthropologist to being a water activist, or perhaps more importantly, how your anthropological background aids you in the work that you currently do.
Well, I guess the short answer is that before I received my PhD, just before I defended, I was awarded a postdoc to go to Sri Lanka and work on irrigate with this International Irrigation Management Institute, which has since changed its name to the International Water Management Institute. And that immediately took me out of academia. I stayed in research, but it was out of academia. But the longer answer I just mentioned is that I started at Arizona with the intention of being an archaeologist, but I wanted to do a prelim. I wanted my dissertation topic to be the interpretation of prehistoric art, specifically Paleolithic cave art in France and Spain. And I wrote my prelim paper, which is the kind of looking at the theories of how you would interpret the Paleolithic art. First place, I decided it's impossible to do that. That if I'm interested in what they're thinking, I better talk to living people. And that drove me to look at international development, because I thought, as long as I'm going to have to deal with real people, I might as well try to do something where real people are faced with some cultural choices, and I want to get involved in international development that is culturally friendly. So that launched me on my non-academic career. I kept trying, I kept applying for things that came open for academic positions because I wanted to go back to academia, but it didn't happen, and I got more settled into being a non-academic. And but I didn't really write much academic stuff until I moved out here from Washington, DC, and then kind of settled into water ethics that's a longer story, but there's life beyond academia for anthropologists. And I think there's a real need for anthropological cultural perspectives, I should say, in the kind of the ongoing modernization process. We don't use that term anymore, but it's still like the field in international development has changed because it's much more effective to hire local academics. I mean, local scholars who speak the local languages and know all the Western stuff too. So rather than hiring me and I have to say, well, my French is kind of bad, but my Hindi is really bad, but I can understand a little bit. You know, like, well, why don't you just get a fluent Hindi speaker? So anyway, it's more challenging, but I think the ethics is a good area, I think, for anthropologists to get involved in, not just in water, but as so much of our progress and advancement in science and technology they've just brushed over the human dimensions of it. And I think there's much more receptivity because of COVID, because people are realizing that there's more to life than having your iPhone. Although iPhone's a lifesaver during lockdowns. So I think that it's a really interesting time to be a humanist and to bring cultural perspectives to bear on whatever topic we're dealing with.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? If not, I have a specific question about your talk. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask my question. One thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is how you mentioned how water ethics, as opposed to sort of legal action towards water protection, there's a strength in it, and that in not being directly tied or being somewhat separate from the legal aspect of it. And I thought that was really intriguing. And do you see these things as sort of being like a carrot and a stick type situation, where like getting people interested in ethics is drawing them into something, as opposed to punishing people for not adhering to ethical principles or something like that? But anyway, I thought that was really interesting, and I think these two things ultimately have to go together. But I don't know. I guess I'm curious about what you think the relationship is between water ethics work and perhaps legal solutions.
I have a slide that I didn't use that is a picture of a boat sailing on the ocean. I mean, it's just a cartoonish one where you have a wavy ocean, and they have a boat, and the boat is called ethics, and the ocean is called law. and the tagline is it's the other way. The boat is law, and the ocean is ethics, and it's law sails on a sea of ethics. And I think that's the connection, is that you have that the legal people are always trying to get, their job is to write the ethics down into something that can hold you legally binding. But they're always behind the times a little bit, because we need water ethics now, and our legal framework doesn't support that. The legal management of water in New Mexico, just the prior appropriation concept, is insane. We shouldn't have. That's not an efficient way of allocating water in an economically or socially good way. But we're stuck with it, and at least for the short term. And it'll take a long time for that to change. I'm sure it will eventually. That's the biggest surprise that foreign guests have when I've talked to water experts who are visiting, and I take them out to look at acequias and look at the 𝗭ощi Dam and things like that. And we talk about prior appropriation, and they're like, "What, really?" Well, usually they've already heard about it, so they're not surprised. But it's just one of those crazy American things, which has a history. There's a reason that we have prior appropriation, but it's no longer a good reason. So, but we're stuck with it, and that's the problem with laws, is that they're not very flexible, and they can't be. And then the other part is that I think that ethics can be, I mean, it can be a nagging, annoying position, or it can be a convening, inviting kind of posture to different stakeholders. So I think it lends itself to the kinds of dialogues that we're going to need to, like, take the Rio Grande. There is not enough water for agriculture at all. And it's not just agriculture that we're worried about. I mean, it is, but it's also the land, the wildlife, the nature, the groundwater, and all that stuff. So we need a healthy ecosystem, which is being starved of water because of the demands from agriculture, and agriculture is already not getting the water it needs to be successful. So we're going to have to make hard choices, and I don't think the legal clout is the way to do it. I think it'll have to be a kind of inviting, I don't know, we'll see how that goes. Then there's an ongoing project right now to look at the supply and demand for water in the Rio Grande through the US Bureau of Reclamation. And they're starting by inventorying everybody's values, which is exactly what they should be doing. Now, how ethics will come in after that remains to be seen, but I think I'm hopeful. I think it's a real interesting time to be involved in water dialogues, where we know there's not enough water to begin to meet everybody's needs. Yet we have to figure out how to share the water we have. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it more than answered my question. Thank you. That was a very good answer. Are there any questions? Josh, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for this talk. This was really interesting. I wanted to, I mean, in particular, I thought, you know, it's encouraging to hear that there are positions and sort of need for anthropologists in this kind of work. And it would be great if there were some kind of centralized place for, you know, for people to find out about those kinds of positions. I'm teaching a course on environmental conflicts now, and we were just talking about this yesterday, you know, how useful these an anthropological perspective can be in sorting through these kinds of conflicts. The question that I had for you, there's sort of two related questions. First, and hopefully one can sort of be an example of the other, but the first one was, you know, where would it fit into sort of the charter, for example, when an indigenous or traditional community wants to use water for a commercial project, for example? Is that protected under the sort of cultural, spiritual principles, or does it sort of fall out of that category because it's not traditional practice? So I'm curious about what happens in those kinds of cases. And then the sort of second part of the question is if you have any examples of, you know, like a really good example of a kind of conflict across different groups that might be emphasizing different aspects of the ethics charters, sort of in contradiction to one another, and how those kinds of things play out.
Well, I think mining is a good example of that. The Oak Flat mine with San Carlos Apache are divided as a tribe about, you know, should we continue to fight against the copper mine coming in and destroying our sacred site of Oak Flat, or should we just accept it and take the jobs and say kiss our sacred lands goodbye? You know, I mean, in a sense, or 𝗭tože𝗵𝗶𝗆𝗆 faced that in the 50s when they were negotiating 𝗭tože Dam and Reservoir. That also split the tribe. I mean, it's because you can see benefits on both sides, but when you're hindsight looking at 𝗭tože Reservoir, it's like, what were they thinking? It's like that's destroyed so much area and very little benefit. And so anyway, that's my pet peeve. I'm just reading this ethnography of 𝗏𝗏𝗏 from the 60s. But I think that those kinds of conflicts are better handled by the tribe. I mean, that's and part of what tribal sovereignty means in terms of water is that, well, we want the tribes to kind of pretend to go back and keep nature alive, and they might need some jobs too. So they're going to be conflicts that are within the tribe, and to some extent it's not our business now, and to another extent it is our business, because we kind of messed up we bequeath them a certain kind of governance system, the tribes. That anyway, it's a long story, but I don't have a simple answer for it, because I don't think it has a simple answer, and it's so much depends on, the context is everything. So, but I would encourage you to for those kinds of conflict stories is to invite in, if there are local examples, some local activists, indigenous activists, to talk about it. And you can get some from inside the department even.
Yeah, thank you. That's those are really interesting cases. I wonder if I could just add a further question on there. Just you mentioned the trope of water protectors sort of as a model here, and wondering, in the charter it sort of talks about the rights of traditional or indigenous groups, but I think one sort of movement in direction, especially coming from indigenous voices in these kinds of conflicts, are about indigenous forms of governance and ethics, environmental ethics and morality, sort of becoming more mainstream. And I wonder if you see that there's any way that something like a water ethics charter could really not just sort of say, well, this is the right of different tribes to have sovereignty over their own local resources and issues, but also opening avenues for positions of authority and leadership for water ethics, considering the failure of colonial society to deal with these issues in a way that doesn't result in disaster.
Well, a number of First Nations in British Columbia have started, or I don't know if it's a movement or just a few that have done it. They've written water statements, mm-hmm. and because of the threats of usually it's mining up there. That so the statements are pretty short and they're kind of a little bit flowery, but they are ways of documenting that we want, that we honor our ancestors and honor the lake and the mountains, and we're not going to hurt them, and so it precludes. It's like, therefore, we're not going to allow this mine to come in here, or we're gonna fight against the mine that wants to come in. But I think there's I personally feel the water ethics charter concept could be really useful for the tribes in their own water issues. First of all, just for encouraging them, providing a framework for them to kind of develop their own statement about what's important and have it in writing, so that when the copper mine proposal comes to their attention, they're not taken by surprise, and they've already kind of worked out what's important to them, what's important to the tribe culturally, and what's not. And I wrote an essay on learning from indigenous water ethics. That it's like one of those things that it's a it's a private, I mean, it's the International Water Association has the copyright to my article, so I can't even share it. But in writing that article, I came to realize how much we can learn from the indigenous perspective as we look at, well, what's really important about preserving nature, and they can articulate through their terminology, which is based on a different ontology, things that we can talk about ecosystem services or cultural values, but we need to nail it down a lot tighter than that to be meaningful, and I think to be effective in negotiations. But suffice it to say that I think that water charters have a particular value in a indigenous setting, because the difficulty of cross-cultural communication is so great that how when you have the industry people, you have the government agents, you have the tribal members of the indigenous community, and I see the anthropology and charters. I mean, you need tools for framing the debate and framing the controversies. I think you need skills, which I probably don't have, but you can find the people with kind of mediation skills, and you can find tools like the charter that could be adapted, and maybe it wouldn't look at all like a charter anymore, but it might look like something it'll be more useful to them if it's designed according to their own values anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you.
I realize I'm getting closer to the screen as I get excited.
Well, I think that we should leave it there for today. We're after 3 o'clock. David, thank you so much again for the talk. It was really wonderful to hear about your work and your perspective, and we're very happy to have you as a part of the department. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for having me. And
all right, everybody, have a wonderful weekend, and see you back here next Friday.